Good morning, everybody. Welcome to the Retail Doctor Group CEO Summit on the State of the Nation. My name is Anastasia Lloyd-Wallace. I am the head of the Consumer Insights Division for Retail Doctor Group. We've got a great panel of speakers this morning, and I'll pass over to Brian.
Good morning, Anastasia, and thank you very much for attending our first digital CEO breakfast. And of course, the State of the Nation, as we're calling it, and it will be part of a series. This morning, we're delighted to welcome our guests. Joel Humel will join us. Joel is our accountant of long-standing, and he'll be talking with us about the government stimulus packages that retailers can benefit. Delighted also to have Belinda McPhee with us, who works with us in HR consulting for ourselves and our clients. Belinda will take us through, obviously, the initiatives and stimulus from the government, particularly Jobkeeper and how it applies to retailers.
Yeah, certainly, Brian. Thanks. Good morning, everyone. Just quickly, firstly, for retailers, I think keeping cash is key in the current environment. So that's got to be balanced, though, against holding on to your key staff and keeping some marketplace presence with your marketing, etc. And now, the idea is these stimulus measures are there to help with that goal. I'll dive straight into the Jobkeeper announcement. So the Jobkeeper payment, I know Belinda's going to cover this, but I'll quickly just bounce through it. The Jobkeeper payment is $1,500 per fortnight per employee. So for a maximum period of 6 months. So we're looking at a maximum amount of $19,500 per employee. So we're talking tens of thousands of dollars here. So it's very worth your while. The issue is that payments don't commence until May. Now, Treasury says the payments will commence the first week in May, and we'll see if that can be accomplished. More importantly, the eligibility criteria, there's this reduction in turnover test. So if your turnover is less than 1 billion, you need to show that your turnover has been reduced by greater than 30% relative to a comparable period a year ago. And that's a period of at least 1 month. So, for example, if you're in a retail business in March 2019, if your turnover was 100,000 for the month of March, then in March 2020, your turnover should be less than 70,000. And that's the same for self-employed individuals who are working in the retail sector. Again, you've got to show that 30% reduction in turnover. On slide 4, just bouncing along to the eligible employees who are entitled to this via their employers is your full-time, your part-time, and your long-term casuals. That's casuals that have been employed for more than 12 months. The employee's got to be at least 16 years of age and an Australian citizen or a holder of a particular visa. That includes our New Zealand cousins with that subclass 444 visa. So to apply, the businesses can register on slide 5. Businesses can register their interest for the job seeker payment on the Australian Taxation Office website. Now, that application looks more like you're applying for a newsletter more than anything, so it's not really substantial at the moment, so hopefully that gets boosted up soon. In terms of how the job seeker payment might apply, the employee, if they ordinarily receive at least $1,500 per fortnight, so more than $1,500 per fortnight, then yes, the employer gets $1,500 per fortnight to put towards their wage, but just say they're on $3,000, yeah, they get the $1,500 from the government, but then the employer must top up the additional $1,500, right? So that's opposed to this circumstance where in retail where you've got lower income earning staff, maybe $800 per fortnight. The employer therefore has to pass on the full $1,500 to them, even though they generally only get $800 per fortnight. So that's a raise for some staff members. So I'll move on to slide 6 now, and onto an old, in a sense, an old-fashioned measure, but one that certainly is very important. That's payment deferrals for tax payments. So if you or your business have been affected by the coronavirus, you've got to mention the coronavirus when you call the ATO, of course, or your agent or your advisor calls the ATO, and you can defer payments for up to 6 months for your income tax, your activity statements, your pay-as-you-go installments, and other items. So that's pretty self-explanatory, but beware your ATO waiting times. They're very variable at the moment because there's a lot of people on the line. slide 7. A third stimulus measure is the pay-as-you-go withholding offset, which has kind of fallen off the radar in the last couple of days due to the Jobkeeper Payment. But this is in addition to the Jobkeeper Payment, right? So this is the pay-as-you-go withholding offset, which is applicable to businesses with a turnover under 50 million. So the ATO is offering 100% offset of pay-as-you-go withholding up to $50,000 in stage 1, and a second stage of $50,000 in stage 2. So stage 1 covers the pay-as-you-go withholding on your activity statements, covering March 2020 to June 2020. And stage 2 covers the pay-as-you-go withholding on the activity statements on July 2020 to October 2020. Now, this pay-as-you-go withholding offset is tax-free, and it has a minimum payment of $10,000. So if you have only $8,000 on, say, your March pay-as-you-go withholding for the, say it's the quarterly BAS, you haven't got too many employees, you'll receive $10,000 minimum. That's the way the offset's going to work. It's be credited to your integrated client account or your BAS account. Moving on to slide 8 there, your monthly lodges, right? So if you lodge monthly, your instalment activity statements, right, you'll be eligible to receive 3 times the pay-as-you-go withholding withheld in March, right? So if you, for example, pay $8,000 in pay-as-you-go withholding for March, you'll receive $24,000 credited to your account. To the extent that you haven't got any other ATO debts owing on your integrated client account, we'd expect some or all of that to be, well, at least say 16,000 of that to be refunded to you within 14 days, right? But if you've got debts there already, it'll be used to offset those debts. Same with quarterly lodges. They'll be eligible to receive the offset for pay-as-you-go withholding amounts on the March 2020 and June 2020 BAS up to $50,000. Now, the second lot of $50,000, stage 2, will be made in sometime between July 2020 and October 2020, and it'll be equal to the stage 1 payment that you got before in relation to the March and June activity statements. Again, it'll be credited to your integrated client account, and really, if you've got a refund owing on that account, that should be refunded out hopefully within 14 days. So moving on to a fourth measure on slide 9, we've got the government guarantee for unsecured loans. So retailers will be able to apply to the major banks for this measure. This is the government saying they'll guarantee 50% of the loan amount on new loans, on these new unsecured loans, right? So at this point, the terms appear to be a loan limit of up to $250,000 per borrower. It's a 3-year loan term and no repayments for the first 6 months. So you need to contact a major bank to inquire about this facility. I know NAB and ANZ, they're already on the front foot on this. And they've got teams, etc., set up to deal with it. But the issue is here, the credit department requirements. So it's a bank loan like any other. You still have to go through the steps of whatever those requirements are. And unless the banks are being more accommodating, unlike they have been in the last few years, it'll break this measure in terms of its usefulness for retailers. It won't be of any use. If, however, they've taken a different stance where they're looking at things differently, given the current crisis, then this could be a good way to support your cash flow until things recover, or even until late May when you get your first of your Jobkeeper payments. A final measure on slide 10 there, we've got wage subsidies for trainees. So again, this is it's worth tens of thousands of dollars really if we can get it. To be eligible to receive this, you've got to have less than 20 full-time employees. The trainee's got to be retained on the books as at the 1st of March 2020. The wage subsidy itself is 50% of the trainee's wage from the 1st of January 2020 to the 30th of September 2020. So it's a maximum amount receivable of $21,000. Again, the application starts from April 2020, so it's probably, hopefully it's up now, and you're registering really through the Australian Apprenticeship Support Network. So you have to look them up on their website and locate your nearest provider and go through your nearest provider on that. So that's some of the main measures as I see them. There's plenty of other measures out there, but these are the ones I think that really help you keep your cash at the moment and support retailers through this. The key one, of course, we're all waiting for is the New South Wales government measure in relation to commercial tenancies. So hopefully that comes soon. Anyway, thank you. That's right.
Thanks, Joel. So we've actually got a lot of questions.
Yeah. Okay.
just popped up during your talk. So
yes.
I'll start from the beginning. Has there been any clarification yet if 457 visa holders are able to receive the Jobkeeper payment?
Okay, just let me double check what I've got here.
That would be temporary residents.
Belinda, jump in.
I can help jump in on that one.
Great,
So
thanks, Belinda.
that's okay. So the immigration lawyers representing obviously all of visa holders across Australia have lobbied the government and identified that there was a gap in terms of missing that core group of workers in Australia. So the government are currently in the course of the next 2 weeks looking to come out with some sort of a relief package for visa holders. So the government's advised all of the immigration legal community to watch this space, and there'll be a further announcement in 2 weeks how that's going to be dealt with visa holders, if that assists.
Great.
Great answer.
Next question is the 30% decline based on a calendar month or a 30-day period?
It's a period. In the Treasury notes, it refers to a period. So I think a 30-day period. It says of at least a month. So really, we're going to need to get some clarity around all this, because we've got businesses, for example, retail businesses that have started up within the last 12 months. They haven't got even 12 months trading yet. They were hitting their straps in December, and this obviously we're hoping that as long as you can, in a sense, self-assess that your turnover has dropped, that you'll be eligible. I certainly know the Real Estate Institute of New South Wales is pushing for that because of the things unique to their industry. But in terms of retailers, there's plenty of retailers who have started up over the last 6 months and are facing a very tough time. And this measure, we're hoping, will allow a self-assessment part. So even if you haven't got a month last year, we're still advising everyone to apply.
Great, and that actually answers another question that we had about businesses that are less than 12 months. So thanks for that, Joel. It's like you psychic.
Yeah.
There's also a question here. So if a business has been on a rapid expansion in the last 12 months, for example, growing the number of stores, 2 stores, 3 stores, it's obviously going to show that there isn't a reduction because they've got a larger overall network now. So I think that probably covers what you've just said as well with regards to the self-assessment and I guess on the individual store basis.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, this is it's a real issue. I don't know if this has been thought through. I mean, the government hasn't had a huge time to think it through, but yeah, this is they're not Robinson Crusoe there. There's a lot of businesses that were building market presence, expanding stores, and then the music stopped. And really, what we'd hope though is if you can show, in terms of self-assessment, you can show that in January, in November, December, January, things were strong, and then show that in, say, March and April, things had tailed off slightly. That will, there's a good argument to be built there.
Mm. And the final question for you, Joel, is if a business is struggling with cash flow to pay the $1,500 a fortnight during April, can they pay it in May when the cash comes in?
Yeah, so what's going on is a lot of businesses are standing down employees, and then when this wage subsidy arrives, I mean, I'll see what Belinda's got to say on this. They're basically restating those employees and using the government stimulus $1,500 to help cover that payment. But in the meantime, there's plenty of businesses that are standing down employees. Like they just can't keep going in the current circumstances. And they're standing down employees, and then not letting, even if the measures provide, which although Belinda will probably talk about, even if you've let employees go, you can bring them back, and it's important you do bring back your key employees. once this government stimulus hits. So you can certainly register and get payments start accruing for them. But I'll let Belinda also answer those as well.
Do you want to chime in on that?
Yes, thanks, Brian. Thanks, Joel. So in terms of the provisions, what the intent is, there's a lot of people that have been stood down without pay, particularly in retail stores that have closed, and some support officers as a result of the social distancing measures. So the government obviously hasn't gone down the forced lockdown process. So businesses have been using, more from a workplace health and safety perspective, the ability to actually close their stores off the back of they can't guarantee health and safety for their staff and their customers, particularly in specialty retail. So as a result, are able to enact the Section 524 of the Fair Work Act and actually stand down people without pay. So with this new job keeper allowance, what that actually allows you to do is you have your stood down employees still on your payroll, but they're effectively paused or frozen, for want of a better word. And this allows you to obviously pass on the payments to them directly using single touch payroll, and essentially the government using the employer as a clearinghouse rather than, you know, keeping people lined up, as we've seen in the media, dealing with Services Australia and Centrelink, by forcing people who've lost their jobs to take the job seeker application and process. So there's some complexity with people that have been made redundant, because if they've been made redundant, they're off your payroll. So there's questions around, would you consider bringing those people back? Would you consider, you know, negotiating with that person to, you know, perhaps the severance component of their pay, elect that they pay that back and get continuity of service, and then that allows them to keep their job and to continue, if the company's eligible, through the job keeper allowance process. The challenge with all of this is it's to be legislated. So Parliament's going to be called to pass legislation very quickly on this. The opposition's obviously not having any issues with it, but largely what's missing is the process attached with it. As Joel said, you go onto the ATO website, you express your interest, and there's no further details. So companies are struggling with, in my experience in the last 24 hours, practically, how do we communicate this to our staff and how do we manage it? And certainly the most effective examples that I've seen are when people are actively engaging with their workforce, communicating and letting them know, watch this space, we're actively investigating it as a company, we're wanting to take this fabulous benefit that the government has put on the table in terms of JobKeeper, and we will keep you updated and we'll regularly communicate to you. So that's what some of the employers that I'm certainly dealing with in the last 24 hours have been doing to address that issue.
Great. Excellent answer. Joel, anything else from you? Or you appreciate your input today. It's been very valuable.
No, thank you, Brian. Thank you.
Thanks. I think just one quick clarification here. So if you have an employee that is on the less than 1,500 a fortnight, and Joel, you stated that with the new legislation they would get said 1,500, do you have to start paying them that now, or would you advise that you wait till the legislation's in place?
Wait for sure. As Belinda mentioned, the legislation hasn't been passed. So, yeah, wait till legislation's in place. And more importantly, we've got to even see, maybe wait until the payments are received in the bank. There's a big difference between them coming through on the 1st of May and coming through in late May. I mean, it's 4 weeks as opposed to 8 weeks, which is going to be a long time in this environment. So, I'm at the moment, I'll certainly listen to what Belinda's got to say, but at the moment I'm saying to the businesses, retailers that we're dealing with is hang on to your cash where possible. And when that amount is received, yes, you've got to, as Belinda said, you've got to act as a clearinghouse to get it out to staff. But until it comes and hits the bank account, I'm not seeing a requirement yet to make payments of 1,500.
That's right. And then the other thing to also consider is you do have to pass on the full 1,500. So there's some complexities that some clients are dealing with in terms of their fortnightly, weekly or monthly payroll cycles, and how to obviously manage that. But the advice to any team members that have been stood down, that are hoping and waiting for JobKeeper to kick in, obviously knowing full well that companies have to go through an application process and it's still to be legislated, the government's very clear message is to have people still apply for job seeker. So The government will have a back-end process between Services Australia and the ATO, so there's no double dipping, and they'll certainly determine which is the most appropriate payment for relevant classifications of employees. But in the interim, the advice is continue through the job seeker process for people that have been stood down without pay until Jobkeeper kicks in, and then obviously there'll be a back-end reconciliation. So that's all of the information that the ATO and the government are providing at this point in time.
So Belinda, we might continue with your overview. Yeah, well, obviously Belinda is extremely credited, as is Joel and everyone here in their disciplines. So over to you, Belinda.
Thanks, Brian. So Brian's brief to me was to give a high-level overview of HR matters, and I'm conscious of time, and Joel's very kindly spoken through the Jobkeeper initiative, so I won't talk any more on that unless there's any further questions. I'll briefly touch on Job Seeker because I think it's important to know what benefits your employees can access if you're reducing hours, if you're closing down your stores temporarily, if you're closing down support office, or if you're going down to emergency staffing levels. So we can talk through that. And then also, you know, what are some of the key challenges and what are some of the best practices that are happening out there? So Russell mentioned earlier, there's been what I would call a employment law meltdown in terms of all of the flow-on effects for businesses around how do you make decisions and be lawful within the Fair Work framework, given the pandemic and all of the, you know, various activities that businesses have to contend with on a daily basis. If anyone's had the pleasant experience of dealing with Fair Work in the past few weeks, you'll know that, you know, there's hours of being on hold, talking to people at Fair Work who quite frankly actually can't answer your question, because the Fair Work Act wasn't actually written and designed for dealing with a pandemic. It was written for other, you know, sort of more traditional industrial matters. And so there's a high degree of interpretation that's required around practically what you can and can't do as it relates to taking elements of the Fair Work Act and putting them into place. So one of the examples, again, that we touched on previously, you'll see a lot of retail businesses have shut down, and under the Fair Work Act, you cannot shut down and stand people down without pay if it's an economic downturn. So if the conditions that cause you to need to close down your business temporarily are due to economic downturn, technically under the Fair Work Act, you can't do that. So one way to work around that, which is off the back of workplace health and safety, because all employers and all CEOs, as you know, what's defined as the PCBU, so the person that's got the controlling interest of safety in the business, is obviously required to guarantee the health and safety of their team members in the workplace. So a few businesses have had the unfortunate experience that they've had COVID outbreaks within their workplace. So they've had some team members that have been diagnosed and they've had to deal with that. If someone acquires COVID-19 as a result of being in your workplace, so it's not through community transmission, it's through transmission that's been proven within your workplace, it poses potential workers' compensation claim issues. So off the back of all of that, a number of retailers, most of the larger groups, Myer, obviously one of the most notable recently, the Just Group, etc., have decided to shut down their staff and their stores temporarily, standing everyone down without pay off the back of the fact that the business can't meet the social distancing requirements and keep their staff and customers safe. So therefore, that enables them lawfully to stand down without pay. So some other considerations to think about when you're looking at what do you do with your workforce. In my experience with my clients, what's worked really, really well is going down the process of consultation, which is required under every award and every enterprise agreement, and having a good relationship with your workforce and agreeing voluntarily and quickly to making changes. So these voluntary changes that can be made reasonably quickly is voluntary reduction of hours. So asking groups of workers, you know, select individual workers depending on function, to voluntarily reduce their hours for a temporary period of time from, for example, 5 days to perhaps 4 or 3 days, and then obviously documenting all of that in writing. So that's worked quite successfully for a number of businesses that I'm involved in. Another thing is utilising the long service and annual leave accruals and provisions for people that have entitlements in those areas, and asking people voluntarily to utilise some of those leave provisions to help obviously take some resources out of the business when you're wanting to, using Scott Morrison's language, put businesses into hibernation. So sending a whole group of workers on leave. So that's also worked successfully. And that's a double-edged sword, of course, because there's a cash flow impact of putting people on leave. But equally, if it takes a core group of workers out of the workforce and gives them a degree of payment, then that's obviously helpful. So in my experience, a lot of these voluntary measures have been incredibly well received by workers. So generally speaking, if companies and employers are advising their team members, we're all in this together, we're taking proactive, preventative measures to endure as a business, then 98% of workers with open arms are embracing, voluntarily agreeing to these arrangements at all levels and allowing businesses to make these changes rapidly. So the key to success that I've seen with a number of businesses that I've been associated with is making changes very quickly and decisively, and then making sure that you have that open engagement and consultation with your workforce to allow these workplace changes to take place, rather than going through some of the more traditional requirements that are under awards and under the Fair Work Act, where it could take weeks and often months of consultation to make changes. So if it's voluntary and by mutual agreement, you can enact change very quickly. And that would be my strong advice and recommendation to get, I guess, take some cost temporarily out of the business by enacting, some of those mechanisms that I've just spoken about. So that's just something to consider. Another consideration is, obviously we're all having this webinar virtually, is the challenges of dealing with a virtual workplace. So lots of businesses for many years that are very traditional have said working from home doesn't work, it's not productive, etc., are now finding that, wow, this could be a new way of working, and are wanting to embrace that longer term. So that's some things to think about in terms of efficiency, productivity, the composition of your workforce, how you actively engage with people to keep them communicated and motivated through this difficult period of time. Another key consideration for all levels of team members, from our business leaders, our CEOs and owners on this webinar, to some of our support office folk in our support offices and warehouses and our staff on the shop floor, is dealing with issues around mental health and well-being. We know that financial crises trigger a lot of mental health and welfare issues for people. So again, making sure that all of the government support is known and actively communicated to your team members. So dipping into the superannuation provisions that will be available from the 20th of April, around tapping into $10,000 of people's superannuation but before 1 July, and then the other ability to tap into a second round of $10,000 to obviously fund people's personal lifestyles and just to survive and live, is available after 1 July. So all of that can be done through MyGov from the 20th of April and through the ATO. So it's very important that people know they can't tap into that until the 20th of April, because if they go onto that information website now, they'll find that they're ineligible, and that causes a lot of growth and frustration. So open communication with your team members and knowing what all of the benefits are that can be passed on to them is incredibly helpful, incredibly appreciated, and allows team members to sort of hibernate, for want of a better word, and wait until they're reinstated if they've been stood down without pay, or whether the business is in a position to actually increase any reduction of hours to a level of a full workforce again. So and as we know, that may take a number of months. So they're just some things that I'm seeing working really, really well from a people perspective. And as leaders, managing leadership teams and managing and manoeuvring through these challenging times, other things that I've seen work really well is having regular, for want of a better word, crisis management huddles with leadership teams, almost on a daily basis, dealing with all of the things that might come up, whether it's from the workforce questions, things posed upon us from government, issues around supply, whatever it could be, that's working very effectively and moving very, very swiftly to make that happen within the space of 1 or 2 days. So again, speed of response is critical, and not waiting days, weeks, and months to make decisions is incredibly important. And as leaders and leadership teams, making sure that there's great transparency and clarity of direction, and equally making sure that you're looking after yourselves and your team members. So from a welfare perspective, you know, making sure you're keeping well, looking after your own mental health, to make sure that you're able to give out those, you know, messages of hope and keeping team members engaged, because everything you do with your teams now through the not so great times, when the good times do eventually come back, they'll remember you for that, whether it's positively or negatively. So it's critically important to, again, you know, draw upon organisational values, you know, personal values. How do we remain strong and focused and ethical through this process, as well as taking commercial risks and being pragmatic and taking swift action to allow for workplace change to happen across large groups of workers. So that's some other things that I'm seeing work well.
Yeah, great summary, great summary. Any questions, Anastasia, for Belinda or the panel?
There was a few questions, but I think you've covered it, Belinda. So maybe just to confirm, so it's, I suppose, can I reduce my employees' hours to $1,500 a fortnight in line with Jobkeeper? You know, is that permitted? And then can they access leave entitlements? And I think if you can just confirm what you were saying, is it's all about this open discussions with your employees and having that voluntary reduction.
No, thanks, Anastasia. So again, as Joel mentioned, there is still a lot of detail that's lacking from the government around Jobkeeper. The spirit and the intent of Jobkeeper is to fund employees that are stood down without pay, first and foremost, so they're getting an income, and keeping them getting income through the employer as a clearinghouse rather than getting them through, obviously, the social security system. So that's the first thing. In terms of people that have had voluntary reduction of hours, the strong message so far from the government, without obviously this being legislated and clearly mandated, is that the Jobkeeper allowance is deemed to be a top-up if there's been any voluntary reduction of hours. So, you know, if my hours have been halved, for example, so if I'm in a store and, you know, we've gone dark and I'm helping support e-commerce activities out of my store, and obviously I'm now eligible for Jobkeeper, it's meant to be a top-up. So that's the direction at this point. Are you able to absorb and eat into that and bring people back and do productive work because of Jobkeeper? That's something that's not yet decided, that we're trying to seek advice on a regular basis. And as soon as we have that advice, we'll pass it on to Brian to pass out to all of the participants on the call. But that's still largely, that detail is still largely to be determined by Parliament.
Wonderful. Thank you.